What happens when Hollywood arrogance meets Philadelphia heart? When a martial arts legend decides to humiliate boxing's most beloved underdog? This is the story that shocked the world and proved that sometimes the quietest heroes deliver the loudest lessons. If you think you know how this ends, think again. Drop her in the comments if you're ready for this wild ride, and let's dive into the night that changed everything. He thought he had already won, until silence changed everything. The year was 2019, and Steven Seagal strutted through the doors of Mickey's boxing gym in Philadelphia like he owned not just the building, but the entire sport of combat itself. At 67, the action star's confidence hadn't diminished one bit from his Hollywood heyday. His black hair, though clearly touched by time and perhaps a stylist, was slicked back with the same precision he once used to snap arms in his movies. The leather jacket creaked as he moved, each step deliberate and theatrical, as if cameras were rolling and directors were shouting, "Action!" But this wasn't a movie set. And the sweat-stained walls of this legendary gym had seen real fighters, real blood, real dreams born and shattered. Seagal's entourage followed behind him like a small army of yes-men, each one nodding at his every word, their expensive suits looking completely out of place among the worn, heavy bags and cracked mirrors that had witnessed decades of Philadelphia boxing history. The gym fell silent as patrons recognized the unmistakable figure of the man who had once dominated action cinema. Some pulled out their phones, others simply stared in disbelief. What was Steven Seagal doing in a place like this? The martial arts legend surveyed the gym with the eye of a conqueror, taking in the faded photographs of local boxing champions, the ring that had hosted countless amateur bouts, and the equipment that had been used by generations of fighters who had nothing but heart and determination. To Seagal, it probably looked primitive, a relic of a bygone era when men settled their differences with fists instead of lawyers and publicists. His lips curled into what might have been called a smile, but carried all the warmth of a winter morning in Siberia. "So this is where the great Rocky Balboa trains," he announced to his followers, his voice carrying that familiar mix of confidence and condescension that had made him famous. "Looks exactly like what I expected from a has-been." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigar, poisoning the atmosphere of a place that had always been sacred to Philadelphia's boxing community. The regulars at Mickey's had heard a lot of trash talk over the years, but there was something particularly venomous about the way Seagal spoke, as if he wasn't just insulting Rocky, but everyone who had ever laced up gloves in this gym. What Seagal didn't know, as he continued his grand tour of mockery, was that Rocky Balboa himself was in the building. The former heavyweight champion was in the back office, quietly reviewing training schedules for the young fighters he mentored, completely unaware that his name was being dragged through the mud just 50 feet away. At 73, Rocky had long since hung up his professional gloves, but his passion for the sport and his dedication to helping the next generation of fighters had never wavered. His hands, scarred from decades of battles in and out of the ring, moved slowly across the paperwork as his mind calculated training regimens and fight preparations with the precision of a master craftsman. The irony wasn't lost on the gym's longtime members who watched Seagal's performance with a mixture of disgust and anticipation. Here was a man whose fight scenes were choreographed and whose victories were scripted, talking down about someone who had faced real opponents with real intentions to hurt him, in front of real crowds with real consequences for failure. Rocky Balboa had taken punches that would have hospitalized most men, had fought when doctors told him he shouldn't, and had risen from the canvas more times than anyone could count. His story wasn't written by Hollywood screenwriters. It was carved out with blood, sweat, and an unbreakable spirit that had inspired millions around the world. But Seagal seemed oblivious to the sacred ground he was desecrating with his words. He moved through the gym like a tourist in a museum, pointing and commenting as if everything around him existed solely for his entertainment. His entourage dutifully laughed at his jokes and nodded at his observations, playing their roles as professional enablers with the dedication of method actors. The martial arts star's ego had clearly grown to proportions that would have impressed even the most narcissistic Hollywood producer, and he showed no signs of restraint as he prepared to deliver what he probably thought would be the ultimate insult. The gym's atmosphere grew thicker with tension as Seagal positioned himself near the main ring, the centerpiece of Mickey's that had hosted some of Philadelphia's most memorable boxing moments. His voice rose deliberately, ensuring that every person in the building could hear his next words. "You know what the problem with Rocky Balboa is?" he announced, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged on his opinions. "He's just a washed-up boxer who got lucky a few times. All those movies made people think he was some kind of hero, but let's be honest, he was never a real fighter. Just a Hollywood creation that people bought into." The words hit the gym like a physical blow, causing several longtime members to stop their workouts entirely. Tommy Benedetto, who had been training at Mickey's for over 30 years and had sparred with Rocky countless times, slowly set down his weights and turned towards Seagal with a look that could have melted steel. Maria Santos, one of the few female trainers at the gym and a former amateur champion herself, clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles went white. Even the teenagers who were new to the gym understood that something sacred had just been violated, though they might not have fully grasped the depth of the insult. Seagal continued his verbal assault with the relentlessness of a machine gun. "I mean, come on, what did he ever really accomplish? He got beat up by Apollo Creed, barely won a few fights against nobodies. And then what? Made a bunch of movies about how tough he was. Please." His laugh was sharp and cutting, designed to wound. "I've been studying martial arts since before that guy even knew how to throw a proper punch. I could have taken him in his prime, and now he's just an old man living off past glory that wasn't even that glorious to begin with." The martial arts legend's confidence seemed to feed off the shocked silence of his audience. In his mind, he was probably delivering a masterclass in psychological warfare, breaking down a legend with nothing but words and attitude. His entourage nodded approvingly, their faces showing the kind of rehearsed agreement that comes from years of being paid to validate someone's ego. But what Seagal interpreted as stunned admiration was actually something far more dangerous, the kind of anger that comes from watching someone desecrate everything you hold sacred. "You want to know what real fighting is?" Seagal asked, beginning to remove his leather jacket with theatrical flair. "It's not about getting beat up and somehow calling that heart. It's about skill, technique, and intelligence. It's about ending fights before they begin, not taking punishment like some kind of masochist." His movements were fluid and practiced, every gesture designed for maximum impact. The jacket fell to the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet gym. Underneath, Seagal wore a black tank top that revealed arms still impressive for a man his age, though perhaps not quite as imposing as they had been in his action movie heyday. His confidence, however, seemed undiminished by the passage of time. If anything, the years had only crystallized his belief in his own superiority, transforming what might once have been mere arrogance into something approaching megalomania. He rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck, producing sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed environment of the gym. "I bet half the people in this gym could take Rocky Balboa today," he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "And the other half probably could have taken him 20 years ago. The man was never that good. He just had good PR, and a city full of people desperate for a hero, even a fake one." The insult wasn't just directed at Rocky anymore. It was an attack on Philadelphia itself, on the dreams and hopes of everyone who had ever seen themselves in the underdog story that Rocky represented. What Seagal failed to notice, as he basked in what he imagined was his moment of triumph, was the subtle shift in the gym's energy. People weren't just angry anymore, they were waiting. The kind of waiting that happens when a community knows that justice is coming, even if they're not sure exactly what form it will take. In the back office, Rocky Balboa had stopped reviewing his paperwork. The voices from the main gym had grown loud enough to penetrate even his concentration, and certain words, his name, spoken with contempt, had finally reached his ears. The sound of a chair being pushed back was barely audible over Seagal's continued monologue, but to those who knew Mickey's gym intimately, it was as unmistakable as a bell tolling midnight. Rocky Balboa was standing up, and after 7 decades of life that had taught him when to walk away and when to stand his ground, he had apparently decided that some insults simply could not go unanswered. The question wasn't whether he would confront Seagal, it was how and what the consequences would be for everyone involved. The footsteps were so quiet, they seemed to belong to a ghost. But everyone in Mickey's gym had learned to recognize that particular rhythm over the years. Rocky Balboa moved through the world differently than other men, not with the swagger of someone trying to prove something, but with the measured pace of someone who had already proven everything he needed to prove, mainly to himself. As he emerged from the back office, the first thing people noticed wasn't his size or his age, but his eyes, those same intense, thoughtful eyes that had stared down some of the most dangerous men in boxing history. At 73, Rocky's hair had gone completely white, and his face carried the roadmap of a life lived fully, with scars that told stories of battles both won and lost. His frame, while not as imposing as it had been in his fighting days, still carried itself with a dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. He wore a simple grey sweatshirt and dark jeans, clothes that spoke of a man who had long ago stopped needing to impress anyone with his appearance. But there was something in his posture, in the way he held his shoulders and moved his hands, that suggested the fighter inside had never really retired. Seagal was still holding court in the center of the gym, completely oblivious to the fact that the subject of his ridicule had entered the building. His monologue had expanded to include criticisms of Philadelphia's boxing culture in general, and he seemed to be enjoying himself immensely as he deconstructed what he saw as the myth of Rocky Balboa. The whole thing was just clever marketing, he was saying to his increasingly uncomfortable-looking entourage. Take a nobody from the streets, give him a few lucky breaks, and suddenly he's America's hero. It's embarrassing, really, how easily people are fooled. Rocky moved through the gym like water flowing around rocks, acknowledging the nods and subtle gestures from longtime friends and training partners without breaking his focus. Tommy Benedetto caught his eye and jerked his head toward Seagal, but Rocky's expression remained neutral, almost meditative. Maria Santos opened her mouth as if to warn him about what had been said, but Rocky held up one hand in a gesture that was both gentle and final. He had heard enough from the back office to understand the situation, and his course of action had already been determined by a moral compass that had never failed him in 7 decades of life. The martial arts legend was demonstrating some kind of hand technique to his followers when Rocky finally came to a stop about 10 feet away from him. There was nothing dramatic about his arrival, no announcement or fanfare. He simply appeared in Seagal's peripheral vision, like a mountain that had always been there but was only now being noticed. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped. Weights were set down with unusual care, and even the youngest fighters in the gym sensed that they were about to witness something significant. Seagal's voice faltered mid-sentence as he registered the presence of the man he had been systematically destroying with his words. For just a moment, his confidence flickered like a candle in a sudden breeze. He had been expecting adulation, perhaps some pushback from Rocky's supporters, maybe even an argument with one of the gym's trainers. What he hadn't expected was to come face to face with the legend himself, standing quietly with his hands at his sides and an expression that revealed absolutely nothing about his intentions. "Well, well," Seagal recovered quickly, his voice regaining its theatrical quality. The man himself, Rocky Balboa in the flesh. He spread his arms wide as if greeting an old friend, but there was something forced about the gesture, something that suggested he was performing for his audience rather than expressing genuine emotion. "I was just telling these folks about your illustrious career. I hope you don't mind the honest assessment." Rocky didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between them like a tightening rope. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the gym's acoustics. "Heard some of what you've been saying." The Philadelphia accent was unmistakable, as familiar to the city's residents as the Liberty Bell or the Rocky statue. "Figured maybe I should come out and listen to the rest of it. You got more to say about me?" The question hung in the air with deceptive simplicity, but everyone present understood that it was loaded with implications. This wasn't just an invitation to continue, it was a challenge wrapped in politeness, a test of whether Seagal would have the courage to repeat his insults to Rocky's face. The martial arts star's entourage shifted nervously, suddenly finding the gym's architecture fascinating, while the regular members moved almost unconsciously to form a loose circle around the two men. Seagal's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I've got plenty to say, Rocky. And since you're here, why don't we make this interesting?" The suggestion carried implications that made several gym members exchange worried glances, but Rocky's expression remained unchanged, as if he had been expecting this exact moment for years and had long ago decided how he would handle it. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a flare, illuminating everything in the gym with harsh, unforgiving light. Seagal's proposition was simple enough on the surface, but everyone present understood that it carried the weight of something much larger than a simple disagreement between two aging fighters. This was about respect, about legacy, about the difference between earned honor and manufactured celebrity. The martial arts star circled Rocky slowly, like a predator sizing up prey, his confidence seeming to grow with each step. "Here's what I'm thinking," Seagal announced, his voice carrying the theatrical quality of someone who had spent decades delivering lines for cameras. "You and me, right here, right now. No gloves, no rules, just pure skill versus whatever it is you think you represent." His gestures were expansive, designed to command attention from every corner of the gym. "I'll prove once and for all that real martial arts beats street brawling every time. Consider it a public service, finally putting to rest the myth of Rocky Balboa." The gym's regulars watched this display with a mixture of fascination and horror. They had seen plenty of tough guys come through Mickey's over the years, each one convinced that they could make their reputation by taking down someone associated with the legendary boxer. Most had been dealt with quickly and quietly by the gym's informal security system, a network of trainers and long-time members who had little patience for troublemakers. But this was different. This was a celebrity, someone with a public platform and a following, turning their sacred space into his personal stage. Rocky listened to the challenge with the same calm attention he had once brought to studying film of upcoming opponents. His eyes never left Seagal's face, but there was no anger there, no rising color or clenched jaw. If anything, he looked almost sad, like a teacher watching a promising student make a terrible mistake. When Seagal finished his dramatic proposal, Rocky was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that made everyone in the gym hold their breath. "You really want to do this?" Rocky asked finally, his voice carrying none of the theater that had characterized Seagal's speech. It was a simple question, asked with genuine curiosity, as if he couldn't quite understand why someone would want to put themselves in this position. "You sure about that? Because once we start, once you make this about more than just words, there ain't no going back from it." Seagal's laugh was sharp and confident. "Are you serious? Rocky, I've been training in martial arts since before you even knew what a boxing gym looked like. I've studied with masters from around the world, learned techniques that took centuries to perfect. You think your crude brawling style is going to work against someone who understands the true science of combat?" He began removing his jewelry with practiced efficiency, watch, rings, chain, each item handed off to members of his entourage like a knight being armed by his squires. The martial arts legend's confidence was infectious, at least among his followers. They nodded approvingly as he listed his qualifications, their faces showing the kind of rehearsed admiration that comes from years of professional agreement. But the gym's regular members weren't impressed. They had seen real fighters prepare for real battles, and there was something almost comical about Seagal's theatrical warm-up routine compared to the quiet, methodical way Rocky was removing his sweatshirt to reveal a plain white t-shirt underneath. "I mean, let's be honest here," Seagal continued, as he began stretching with exaggerated movements that looked more like a performance than actual preparation. "What's your best-case scenario? You get lucky and land a few punches? Big deal. I'll have you on the ground and unconscious before you even know what hit you. Aikido isn't about trading blows like some kind of savage. It's about using your opponent's energy against them, ending fights with efficiency and intelligence." Rocky folded his sweatshirt carefully and set it on a nearby bench, his movements economical and without flourish. Several gym members had pulled out their phones, understanding that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Tommy Benedetto had moved closer to the impromptu fighting area, his face a mask of concern mixed with anticipation. Maria Santos was speaking quietly into her phone, probably calling for additional witnesses, or maybe just making sure someone would be able to tell the story accurately later. The space around the two men had naturally cleared, creating an informal ring bordered by heavy bags and exercise equipment. It wasn't the polished environment of a professional boxing match or even an organized sparring session, but rather the kind of raw, honest space where disputes had been settled for as long as men had disagreed with each other. The lighting was harsh and unforgiving, the kind that revealed every line on a face and every doubt in a person's eyes. But as Rocky turned to face his challenger, there was no doubt visible in his expression. Instead, there was something that the longtime members of Mickey's gym recognized immediately, the same look he had worn when facing Apollo Creed for the first time, or when stepping into the ring with Ivan Drago, or during any of the moments when everything he had worked for hung in the balance. It was the look of a man who had found his center and was ready to do what needed to be done, regardless of the consequences. The transformation in the gym's atmosphere was palpable, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Seagal had finished his elaborate warm-up routine and now stood in what he probably considered a fighting stance, his hands positioned in the classical Aikido manner that had served him well in countless choreographed movie battles. His confidence radiated from every pore, and why shouldn't it? He was facing a 73-year-old retired boxer who hadn't been in a real fight in decades, a man whose reflexes and strength had inevitably diminished with age. Rocky's preparation, by contrast, was almost invisible. He simply stood there, his feet positioned naturally, his hands hanging loose at his sides. To the untrained eye, he might have looked completely unprepared, even vulnerable. But the gym's veteran members knew better. They recognized the deceptive stillness of a man who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy for when it mattered most, who understood that the most dangerous fighters were often those who looked the least threatening. "You know what, Rocky?" Seagal said, beginning to move in a slow circle around his opponent. "I'm actually going to enjoy this. Not just beating you, but showing everyone here what real fighting looks like. No more of this Hollywood mythology, no more romantic nonsense about heart and determination conquering skill and training." His movements were fluid and practiced, each step calculated for maximum psychological impact. This is going to be a lesson in reality. The martial arts star's entourage had positioned themselves for optimal viewing, their phones already recording what they clearly expected to be their boss's moment of triumph. Several had begun live streaming, undoubtedly anticipating the viral potential of Steven Seagal definitively defeating Rocky Balboa in his own gym. The narrative practically wrote itself. aging action star proves that real martial arts beats movie boxing, settles decades-old debate about authentic fighting versus Hollywood fiction. But something was wrong with the picture, and the gym's regulars could feel it even if they couldn't articulate exactly what it was. Maybe it was the way Rocky's breathing remained steady and controlled, while Seagal's showed subtle signs of adrenaline. Maybe it was the fact that the former champion's eyes never lost their focus, never followed the theatrical movements, but instead remained locked on his opponent's center mass. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated wisdom of years spent in places where real fighting happened, giving them the ability to distinguish between someone who looked dangerous and someone who actually was. "You ready for this, old man?" Seagal asked, his voice carrying a taunt that was probably meant to provoke an emotional reaction. "Because I'm about to show you and everyone in this dump what happens when fantasy meets reality. No cameras, no script, no director to yell, 'Cut,' when things get too real for you." Rocky's response was barely above a whisper, but in the charged silence of the gym, every word carried clearly. "Been ready my whole life." The simplicity of the statement somehow made it more powerful than all of Seagal's elaborate speeches. There was no boasting, no threats, no promises of what was about to happen. Just a quiet acknowledgement of readiness that carried the weight of 7 decades of experience with conflict, violence, and the thin line between victory and defeat. The first move came without warning or fanfare. Seagal launched into what appeared to be a textbook Aikido technique, his body moving with the fluid grace that had made him famous in action movies around the world. His hands reached for Rocky's arms, intending to use the boxer's own momentum against him in a classic redirection that should have ended with the older man on the ground, possibly unconscious, definitely humiliated. But Rocky Balboa wasn't there anymore. The spot where he had been standing was suddenly empty, and Seagal found himself grasping at air while his own forward momentum carried him past his intended target. It wasn't a dramatic dodge or an athletic leap to safety. Rocky had simply stepped aside with the economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of understanding exactly how much space a human body occupies and exactly how little movement is required to be somewhere else. The martial arts legend stumbled slightly, his perfect technique disrupted by the absence of the resistance he had been expecting. For just a moment, confusion flickered across his features, quickly replaced by irritation and then by renewed determination. This was just a lucky break, a momentary slip in what was still obviously going to be his inevitable victory. He turned quickly, already planning his next attack, already composing the speech he would give afterward about the importance of respecting real martial arts. But as Seagal regained his balance and prepared for his second assault, he noticed something that made his confident smile falter just slightly. Rocky hadn't moved far. In fact, he was standing almost exactly where he had been before, his hands still at his sides, his expression still maddeningly calm. But now there was something different in his eyes, a spark of recognition that suggested the real fight was just beginning. The second attack came faster than the first, with Seagal attempting to compensate for his initial failure by adding speed and aggression to his technique. This time he went for a more direct approach, a striking combination that had worked flawlessly in dozens of films and countless demonstrations. His hands moved in precise patterns, each motion designed to overwhelm his opponent with superior skill and conditioning. The martial arts legend's confidence was returning with each movement, his body remembering the muscle memory of 1,000 choreographed victories. Rocky's response was almost artistic in its simplicity. As Seagal's strikes came toward him, the former champion began to move, in ways that seemed to defy logic and expectation. It wasn't the flashy defensive work of a young fighter trying to impress spectators, nor was it the desperate scrambling of someone overwhelmed by superior technique. Instead, it was something that the gym's older members recognized immediately, the defensive instincts of a man who had survived battles with some of the most dangerous punchers in boxing history. Every movement was economical, every step calculated to use the minimum energy necessary to avoid maximum damage. Seagal's strikes whistled through empty air as Rocky seemed to flow around them like water around stones. The martial arts star's techniques were undoubtedly impressive from a technical standpoint, but they were designed for opponents who would engage with them, who would provide the resistance and predictable reactions that Aikido required to function effectively. "Stop running away!" Seagal snarled, his theatrical composure beginning to crack as his elaborate attacks continued to find nothing but empty space. Sweat was starting to appear on his forehead, despite the relatively cool temperature of the gym, and his breathing was becoming noticeably heavier. "Stand and fight like a man instead of dancing around like some kind of coward." The insult hung in the air for a moment before Rocky finally responded, but not with words. Instead, he planted his feet for the first time since the confrontation had begun, abandoning his defensive movement to stand directly in front of his opponent. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable, shoulders squaring, weight settling, hands coming up just slightly from their relaxed position at his sides. Seagal saw the change as an opportunity, the moment he had been waiting for, when his opponent would finally engage properly and allow the superior martial artist to demonstrate his dominance. He launched into what was probably his most devastating combination, a series of strikes and grappling attempts that represented decades of training in multiple disciplines. His confidence was soaring again as he committed fully to the attack, certain that this would be the moment when reality reasserted itself and natural order was restored. But something extraordinary happened in the space between Seagal's confident advance and the moment his techniques should have found their target. Rocky Balboa, the 73-year-old retired boxer who supposedly represented nothing more than outdated mythology and Hollywood fantasy, threw a single punch. Not a combination, not a complex defensive counterattack, not even a particularly spectacular display of boxing technique. Just one punch, thrown with the kind of precision and timing that can only be developed through decades of throwing punches at people who are genuinely trying to hurt you in return. The sound that filled Mickey's gym wasn't the dramatic crash of bodies hitting the floor or the theatrical grunts of movie combat. It was something much simpler and infinitely more final. The solid, unmistakable thud of a perfectly thrown punch connecting with its intended target. Seagal's elaborate attack simply ceased to exist. His forward momentum stopped as completely as if he had run into a wall. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the martial arts legend stood perfectly still, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been recognition. The confident expression that had dominated his features since walking into the gym was gone, replaced by the blank surprise of someone who had just discovered that the world operated very differently than he had believed. Then, with a grace that would have been almost balletic if it weren't so devastating, Steven Seagal began to fall. Not the dramatic, choreographed collapse of a movie death scene, but the simple, inevitable surrender to gravity that follows when the lights go out upstairs and nobody's home to keep the body upright. The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by the sound of Seagal's body settling onto the gym floor and the quiet whisper of Rocky's breathing as he stood over his fallen challenger. Every phone in the gym was still recording, capturing a moment that would undoubtedly become part of boxing folklore. But for now, all anyone could do was stare at the scene before them in stunned amazement. The silence stretched across Mickey's gym like a blanket, muffling even the ambient sounds of the city beyond its walls. Steven Seagal lay motionless on the worn wooden floor, his expensive clothes suddenly looking incongruous against the honest grit of the boxing gym. His entourage stood frozen in place, their phones still recording, but their faces showing the kind of shock that comes from watching an entire worldview crumble in real time. The martial arts legend who had walked in with such supreme confidence was now unconscious at the feet of the man he had dismissed as a washed-up has-been. Rocky stood perfectly still, his breathing steady and controlled, showing no signs of exertion from what had been perhaps the briefest fight in the gym's long history. His expression remained neutral, almost meditative, as if he were contemplating something far more complex than the simple physical confrontation that had just concluded. There was no celebration in his posture, no triumphant gesture or victory dance. Instead, he looked down at Seagal with something that might have been sadness, or perhaps disappointment that it had come to this at all. The gym's regular members began to stir from their stunned paralysis, moving closer to the scene with the cautious steps of people who weren't entirely sure what they had just witnessed. Tommy Benedetto was the first to reach Seagal's side, kneeling down to check for signs of consciousness or injury. His examination was quick but thorough, the kind of assessment that came from decades of seeing fighters pushed to their limits and beyond. "He's breathing fine," Tommy announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen plenty of knockouts over the years. "Pulse is steady. He's just out cold." The diagnosis seemed to release some of the tension that had been building in the room, though the underlying amazement at what they had witnessed remained palpable. Maria Santos had produced a small bottle of water from somewhere and was gently applying some to Seagal's forehead, her movements showing the kind of professional care that came from years of working with fighters who had pushed themselves too far. Despite her obvious loyalty to Rocky and her anger at the insults that had been thrown around, she tended to the unconscious martial artist with the same attention she would have given to any fighter who needed help. Rocky finally moved, but only to retrieve his sweatshirt from the bench where he had carefully folded it. He pulled it on with the same deliberate movements he had shown throughout the confrontation, each action economical and purposeful. As he adjusted the garment, several members of the gym began to approach him, their faces showing a mixture of awe and the desire to express their appreciation for what he had just done. But Rocky held up one hand in a gesture that was both gentle and final, indicating that he wasn't interested in congratulations or analysis of what had just occurred. His eyes swept across the faces of Seagal's entourage, taking in their shock and uncertainty with the same calm assessment he had shown their boss. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the gym's acoustics. "Maybe somebody should call for a cab," he suggested, nodding toward the still unconscious Seagal. "And maybe next time, before somebody comes into a place and starts talking about things they don't understand, they should think about whether they really want to find out if they're right or wrong." The words weren't delivered as a threat or a boast, but rather as a gentle piece of advice, the kind an older man might give to a younger person who was about to make a serious mistake. There was no anger in Rocky's voice, no satisfaction at having proven his point so definitively. If anything, he sounded tired, as if the entire confrontation had been an unnecessary distraction from more important matters. Seagal's followers scrambled to follow Rocky's suggestion, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Phone calls were made, arrangements were discussed in hushed tones, and gradually the reality of their situation began to sink in. Their invincible martial arts hero was unconscious on the floor of a Philadelphia boxing gym, defeated by a single punch from a man he had dismissed as a Hollywood fantasy. As they worked to organize their boss's departure, Rocky moved toward the back of the gym, apparently intending to return to whatever business had originally brought him there. But he paused at the edge of the crowd that had gathered around the fallen Seagal, his attention caught by something that made him reconsider his withdrawal from the situation. One of Seagal's younger followers, a man who couldn't have been more than 25, was staring at his unconscious mentor with an expression that Rocky recognized immediately. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of strength and power had just been fundamentally challenged, someone who was questioning everything they thought they knew about fighting, about heroes, and about the difference between reality and performance. Rocky approached the young man with the same careful consideration he had shown throughout the entire confrontation, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. Up close, it was clear that this wasn't just another paid member of Seagal's entourage, but someone who had probably looked up to the martial arts star as a genuine hero. The disappointment and confusion in his eyes spoke of someone whose world had just been turned upside down by the gap between expectation and reality. "You okay, son?" Rocky asked, his voice carrying the kind of gentle concern that had made him as effective a trainer as he had been a fighter. The question seemed to catch the young man off guard, as if he hadn't expected personal attention from someone he had just watched knock out his hero with a single punch. I don't understand," the young man stammered, his eyes moving back and forth between Rocky and the still unconscious Seagal. "He's trained for decades. He's mastered multiple martial arts. How did you do that so easily?" Rocky considered the question for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Around them, the business of dealing with Seagal's unconscious form continued, but the former champion's attention was focused entirely on this young man who was struggling to understand what he had just witnessed. When Rocky finally responded, his words carried the weight of decades spent learning hard lessons about life, fighting, and the difference between the two. "Training's important," Rocky said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Technique matters, discipline matters, all that stuff your boss was talking about. That's all real. But there's something else, something you can't learn in a classroom or a movie studio or even a regular gym." He gestured around Mickey's, taking in the scarred walls and worn equipment that had witnessed countless battles over the years. "See, your friend there. He learned how to fight in places where nobody was really trying to hurt him. Where the outcome was decided before the first punch was thrown, where looking good was more important than being effective." Rocky's voice remained gentle, but there was an underlying firmness that suggested he was sharing something important. Real fighting, the kind that matters, that happens when everything's on the line and there's nowhere to run and nobody's gonna save you. That's different. The young man listened intently, his earlier shock giving way to genuine curiosity. Several other members of Seagal's group had moved closer, apparently drawn by the rare opportunity to hear Rocky Balboa explain his philosophy of combat. Even some of the gym's regular members had stopped their activities to listen, understanding that they were witnessing something special, not just the aftermath of a fight, but a teaching moment from one of boxing's greatest legends. "You know what the difference is between me and him?" Rocky continued, nodding toward the unconscious Seagal. "It ain't talent, it ain't training, it ain't even experience, though those things matter. The difference is that when I stepped into a ring, there was always somebody across from me who genuinely wanted to hurt me, who had trained just as hard as I had, who wanted to win just as much as I did, and who was willing to do whatever it took to put me down and keep me there." The words seemed to resonate with the young man, whose expression showed the beginning of understanding. Around them, Seagal was beginning to stir slightly, showing the first signs of returning consciousness, but the impromptu lesson continued without interruption. "Your boss came in here talking about skill and technique like they were magic words that could replace everything else," Rocky said. "But skill without heart is just choreography. Technique without courage is just dancing. And all the training in the world don't mean nothing if you ain't never been tested by somebody who really, truly wants to beat you." Tommy Benedetto had produced a small ice pack from the gym's first aid kit and was gently applying it to Seagal's forehead. The martial arts star's eyes were beginning to flutter, and confused murmurs were escaping his lips as consciousness gradually returned. His entourage gathered around him with renewed attention, their phones switching from recording mode to making practical arrangements for getting their boss safely out of the gym. But Rocky's attention remained focused on the young man, who was now looking at the scene with new eyes. "Don't get me wrong," the former champion continued. "Martial arts are beautiful. They're effective. They can teach you discipline and respect and all kinds of important things. But they can't teach you what it feels like when Ivan Drago is trying to take your head off in front of 50,000 people, or what you do when Apollo Creed is faster and stronger and better than you'll ever be, but you still got to find a way to survive 15 rounds. The lesson was interrupted by Seagal finally sitting up, his movement unsteady and his expression confused. The martial arts star looked around the gym, as if seeing it for the first time, his eyes taking in the concerned faces of his followers and the carefully neutral expressions of the gym's regular members. When his gaze finally found Rocky, there was none of the earlier arrogance or theatrical confidence, just the bewildered look of someone trying to piece together what had happened to him. "Easy there," Tommy said, his voice carrying the professional calm of someone who had helped countless fighters recover from hard shots over the years. "You took a pretty good knock. Just sit still for a minute and let your head clear." Seagal's attempt to speak came out as little more than a mumble, his words slurred and indistinct. The confident orator who had dominated the gym's acoustics just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who was clearly struggling with the basic mechanics of consciousness. His entourage exchanged worried glances, probably calculating how this incident would affect their boss's public image and their own employment prospects. Rocky watched this recovery process with the same calm attention he had shown throughout the entire confrontation, but there was something different in his expression now, a sadness that seemed to go beyond the simple aftermath of a physical altercation. When he turned back to the young man who had asked the original question, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was thinking about more than just the events of the last few minutes. "You want to know the real tragedy here?" Rocky asked the young man, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the gym's suddenly hushed atmosphere. "It ain't that your boss got knocked out. That happens to everybody who fights long enough. Happened to me more times than I care to remember. The tragedy is that he came in here so sure he already knew everything that he couldn't learn nothing." Seagal was now sitting upright with assistance, his head clearing enough to follow the conversation, though his expression remained dazed and confused. The martial arts star's earlier confidence had been completely replaced by the kind of vulnerability that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about yourself proved catastrophically wrong in front of an audience. His expensive clothes were rumpled, his carefully styled hair was disheveled, and the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him was as gone as yesterday's weather. "See, fighting ain't really about fighting," Rocky continued, addressing not just the young man, but everyone within earshot. "It's about understanding yourself, about knowing what you're made of when everything goes wrong and there's nowhere to hide. Your boss walked in here thinking he was teaching us something, but he never gave himself the chance to learn nothing because he already decided he knew it all." The words weren't delivered as an attack on the fallen Seagal, but rather as a gentle explanation of a deeper truth that the martial arts star had missed in his pursuit of dominance and recognition. Rocky's tone remained compassionate even as he dissected the fundamental flaws in his opponent's approach to both combat and life. Maria Santos had produced a folding chair from somewhere and helped Seagal into it, her movements showing the same professional care she would have extended to any fighter who needed assistance. Despite the insults that had been thrown around earlier, there was no malice in her treatment of the defeated martial artist, just the kind of human decency that characterized Mickey's gym's approach to everyone who walked through its doors. "The thing about real fighting," Rocky went on, "is that it teaches you humility, whether you want to learn it or not. Every fighter I ever respected, from Apollo Creed to Ivan Drago to Clubber Lang, they all had one thing in common. They knew they could lose. They knew that on any given night, if they weren't at their best and their opponent was having the fight of his life, they could end up on their back looking up at the lights." Several of Seagal's entourage members were now actively making phone calls, probably trying to arrange transportation and possibly medical attention for their boss. The earlier atmosphere of confident expectation had been completely replaced by the kind of practical urgency that comes from dealing with an unexpected crisis. Their carefully planned publicity stunt had turned into a potential public relations disaster, and damage control was clearly the order of the day. But the young man who had started this conversation seemed less interested in the practical implications than in understanding what had just happened on a deeper level. "So how do you learn that?" he asked. "How do you get that kind of, I don't know what to call it, that real fighting ability?" Rocky smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun, and the expression transformed his entire face. "You don't learn it, son. You earn it. Every scar, every time you get knocked down, every fight where you thought you might not make it to the final bell, that's where it comes from. It ain't pretty, it ain't glamorous, and it sure ain't something you can fake for the cameras." Seagal finally managed to speak clearly, though his voice lacked any of its earlier theatrical power. What happened? Did you—" He looked around the gym, as if trying to piece together the events that had led to him sitting in a folding chair with an ice pack on his head. The confident martial arts master who had dominated the space just minutes earlier seemed like a different person entirely. "You got knocked out," Tommy Benedetto said matter-of-factly, his tone carrying no judgment or mockery, just the simple statement of facts that was characteristic of boxing gyms everywhere. "Clean shot, lights out, down you went. Happens to the best of us." The martial arts star's expression showed the kind of shock that comes from discovering that reality operates very differently from your expectations about it. For someone who had probably never experienced genuine defeat in a real combat situation, the psychological impact was clearly as significant as the physical one. His entire worldview had been challenged in the most direct way possible, and the process of rebuilding would undoubtedly take considerable time and effort. Rocky moved closer to Seagal, his approach careful and non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice carried the same gentle concern he had shown the young man. "You gonna be okay? You need us to call somebody, get you to a doctor or anything?" The questions were asked with genuine concern, without any trace of the mockery or triumph that might have been expected from someone who had just definitively won such a public confrontation. "I don't understand," Seagal mumbled, his confusion still evident. "I've been training for 40 years. I've studied with masters. How did this happen?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Rocky's response came without hesitation and without malice. "Because you were fighting the idea of Rocky Balboa instead of fighting Rocky Balboa. You came in here with a story already written in your head about how this was gonna go, and you never stopped to consider that maybe the story was wrong. The lesson that followed wasn't delivered as a lecture or a sermon, but as a quiet conversation between men who had both learned hard truths about life, though in very different ways." Rocky pulled up another folding chair and sat down across from Seagal, the gesture transforming what could have been a moment of triumph into something more resembling a teaching opportunity. The gym's other occupants formed a loose circle around them, understanding that they were witnessing something more significant than the aftermath of a brief fight. "You know what your real mistake was?" Rocky asked, his voice gentle but clear. "It wasn't underestimating me, though you did that. It wasn't overestimating yourself, though you did that too. Your real mistake was thinking that fighting was about proving something instead of learning something." Seagal's head was clearing gradually, and with returning consciousness came the beginning of understanding about what had happened to him. The martial arts star looked around the gym with new eyes, taking in details that he had missed during his earlier theatrical performance. The worn equipment, the faded photographs of local champions, the faces of people who had spent their lives in places where combat was honest and consequences were real. "Every fight I ever had," Rocky continued, "I learned something. Sometimes I learned that I was tougher than I thought. Sometimes I learned that I wasn't as good as I hoped. But I always learned something, because that's what fighting does. It shows you the truth about yourself, whether you want to see it or not." The former champion's words seemed to resonate not just with Seagal, but with everyone listening. Several of the gym's regular members nodded in recognition of truths they had learned in their own battles, while Seagal's followers listened with the attention of people hearing a completely new perspective on something they thought they understood. "You came in here tonight thinking you were going to teach us about real fighting," Rocky went on. "But real fighting ain't about techniques or systems or styles. It's about what happens when everything you planned stops working and you got to find something inside yourself that you didn't even know was there." Seagal was listening now with complete attention, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been genuine curiosity. The ice pack had reduced the swelling on his forehead, but the real healing, the kind that would address the deeper wounds to his pride and self-perception, would clearly take much longer. "I'm sorry," the martial arts star said suddenly, the words coming out with obvious difficulty. I said some things that were out of line. About you, about this place, about boxing in general. I was wrong." The apology seemed to surprise even his own entourage, several of whom exchanged glances that suggested they had rarely, if ever, heard their boss admit error. But Rocky accepted it with the same grace he had shown throughout the entire encounter, nodding in acknowledgement without making a big production of the moment. "We all make mistakes," Rocky replied. "The question is what we do after we make them. You can let this be the end of something, or you can let it be the beginning of something else." As if to emphasize the point, Rocky stood up and extended his hand to Seagal. The gesture was simple but profound, an offer of reconciliation from the victor to the vanquished, a bridge between the world of manufactured celebrity and authentic accomplishment. For a moment, Seagal stared at the outstretched hand, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then, with movements that were still slightly unsteady, Steven Seagal stood up and shook Rocky Balboa's hand. The handshake lasted longer than might have been expected, and when it ended, both men seemed somehow different than they had been before the evening's events began. "Maybe," Rocky said quietly, "next time you want to learn about fighting, you should try starting with a question instead of a statement." The suggestion carried implications that extended far beyond combat training, touching on approaches to life, learning, and the fundamental human challenge of remaining open to new information, even when it conflicts with what we want to believe about ourselves. As Seagal's group prepared to leave Mickey's gym, the atmosphere had changed completely from what it had been when they arrived. The theatrical confidence and manufactured controversy had been replaced by something more honest and ultimately more valuable, a moment of genuine human connection between men who had learned different lessons from their encounters with conflict and competition. The young man who had asked the original question approached Rocky one final time as the group prepared to depart. "Mr. Balboa," he said, "thank you for explaining all that. I think I understand now what you meant about the difference between fighting and real fighting." Rocky smiled and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Just remember, son, the most important battles you'll ever fight won't be in a ring or a gym. They'll be with yourself, when nobody's watching and there's no crowd to cheer you on. That's where you find out what you're really made of." As the doors of Mickey's gym closed behind Steven Seagal and his entourage, the legendary training facility returned to its normal rhythm of honest work and authentic preparation. But the lesson of that night would echo far beyond those walls, spreading through social media and word of mouth as a reminder that real strength comes not from what we claim to be, but from what we prove ourselves to be when everything is on the line. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with fists, but with character. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come not from success, but from the humility to learn from failure. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the difference between performing strength and possessing it, drop A in the comments below. And remember, the fight that matters most is always the one you have with yourself. Subscribe for more stories that prove heartbeats hype every single time.